Alex, you launched your company, Strategy and Rest, which is such an amazing name for a company, to advocate for the 4-day work week after coming out of a job as a senior consultant at Institute for the Future, a very well-known think tank, and strategic business insights, which together, I guess, formed two of the most well-regarded think tanks in your region of the world, in the Silicon Valley. So working for these organizations is stressful. It's time zone, I guess, ignorant. You have to be on all the time. Consulting itself means you are somewhat on other people's schedules. So it must have been a pretty hectic life that you have had. What drew you personally? What is your personal why of switching over and launching a company called Strategy and Rest? Like,
Mhm.
why were you drawn towards creating a movement around a 4-day work week?
Yeah, that's a great question. And um, the the really simple answer is that it was an attempt to solve or and then to sort of share sort of the solutions that I found to or the problems that you have as as a consultant in Silicon Valley, right? This was work that I had done for about 10 years or so. Fascinating stuff, really interesting clients. This is a wonderfully vibrant area for someone who likes to think about technology. But, you always have a sense that you're like half, half a project out of phase. And the only way in which to try and deal with that, it always felt like, was to try to sort of work ever harder, right?
Right.
Of course, that's not really sustainable. And we all know it, but it's difficult to imagine an alternative. And so, like a lot of people, sort of ultimately, I sort of burned out on that and had to take a step back, but discovered, I was lucky enough to have a sabbatical at Microsoft Research and sort of began the work on the research that eventually became my book, Distraction Addiction. But I also had the experience there that sort of discovering sort of the value of rest and its importance, and its sort of and its value in sort of the presence of sort of even in lives that are sort of that seem on the outside super busy, done by people who are very passionate about their work, that are very dedicated, sort of, and really want to sort of do great things in the world. That book came out, and then, but most of the people I was studying there were like Nobel Prize winners and famous authors, and people have a lot of control over their schedules. And so I always got the question, all right, what about everybody else? If you're working a 9-to-5 job, does this apply? And I didn't answer that question in rest, and was never really satisfied with the answers I gave. And so I went looking for them. And in the course of doing that, stumbled upon some companies, 2017, 2018, that were moving to 4-day work weeks without cutting salaries and without cutting expectations around like output or client services or delivery, et cetera. And it seemed to me that, they were solving the problem of how do you get more rest in these kinds of jobs by changing the structures in which they worked, by making it available to everybody. And so, having been a futurist, you're kind of sort of taught to look for what we call weak signals, right? Weird, interesting things happening in different parts of the world or industries that suggest the beginnings of a new movement. And what I was seeing here were companies all over the world pursuing this strategy for largely the same reasons, who didn't know about each other. And so this was a movement that was just getting started, that really wasn't aware of itself as a movement, at which point, like, I realized this is a story really worth telling. And and having written that book, or shorter, I realized that there was not just more to be said about it, but more to be done with it. And so that's and started Strategy and Rest to sort of help other organizations sort of figure out their own path to sort of a shorter work week. So, long answer to a simple question.
Wow. And Valley just shared in the chat a message you stand by. The 4-day work week is here. and it works for everyone, which sounds so great. It sounds so wholesome. And I love how you described your own journey, because you became famous with your first book by discovering that these luminaries that we all quote all the time and mention, and systems they created we are using, that they were kind of slacking around, and they were working much less than most of us are today, which immediately made you famous, and you were on so many TV shows and radio shows explaining how these workdays look like, until then discovering maybe I should focus on my contemporaries who are working more than ever, and then you discovered a hidden movement. Fantastic a choice. And the really cool thing, what is happening on Remote Daily, is that I guess most of you are not working on that rhythm yet, but there is somebody in the room today who actually does. And Valley just put in the chat, Paul is back on the show. Paul has been a early adopter of remote work, one of the first in Canada, and has rolled out a 4-day work week for his entire team at Tahima. Congrats to you, Paul, and look forward to hearing more from you across the session today. However, though, for most of us, and I include myself, the 4-day work week is still far away. So actually, while researching for today's topic, we actually found an article on Quartz, which is our media partner, where two of India's top tech leaders, executives at large companies called Infosys and Ola, they were quoted by saying, you know what, why don't you pull a 70-hour work week and a 15-hour day? Because that's perfectly reasonable especially when you're a junior in the company. I mean, we all know that in Japan, there's even a word for where this leads to, working yourself to death. So there is still a strong notion, and I think especially in the part of the world you're in, Alex, in the Silicon Valley, that of people who would probably agree with this executives and say, oh yeah, of course, when you start your career, you have to overwork. I mean, there's no other way to be seen and to have impact. So 4-day work week, to many of us, whether junior or senior, it still is a little bit of an unrealistic concept. We wouldn't know actually where to start, how to do it. What is your message to all of us, Alex? Like, what do you tell all of us who say, yeah, sounds nice. I came to this show today because I want to dream. I want to get inspired, but that's not going to work out for me and the people that I consider my peers.
Right. I think you are absolutely right that there are, in some industries, some pretty strong cultural barriers to sort of thinking about reducing working hours. When I was first talking about this here in Silicon Valley, I realized we can talk, sort of, you can imagine anything, right? Reinventing money, sort of putting everything on the blockchain, virtual reality, you sort of life extension, but talk about doing a 4-day week, and it's like you're some sort of medieval sorcerer, or something. But I think that the first response I would give is that the companies that have moved to 4-day weeks are exactly in the industries that sort of where these assumptions, this kind of culture of overwork, the assumption that long hours aren't just inevitable and inescapable, but they're a sign of your stamina, your dedication, your professionalism. These are the industries that were the earliest adopters of the 4-day week. So like Michelin-starred restaurants, fintech companies, software startups, sort of design firms. And some of them have been incredibly successful, right? There were at least 3 companies that are, or 3 tech companies that are unicorns worth, more than $1 billion, that have, whose success is built partly upon having worked a 4-day work week, sometimes from the very beginning or sometimes adopting it. And that and there's a growing body of data that shows that a 4-day week is, it's great for people, but it's also really good for teams and company culture, and for the resilience and stability of organizations as well. So, I think and then the final thing I would say is that if you're skeptical, you can also just wait and see what your competition does, because by now, in virtually every industry, there is someone who has taken this leap. And, you can, and I would urge you to sort of learn from them before, sort of before they take your best people and sort of your most interesting customers.
Who are these unicorns that you mentioned that are already sort of doing it?
Right. So there's Bolt in Silicon Valley, and then there is Cockroach Labs in New York, which does
Very
their
fitting name.
valuation is about $5 billion, and they do cloud-based SQL servers or software. I don't really know what that means, but apparently, the thing is that sort of the doing SQL servers that are native in the cloud is like this incredibly interesting technical challenge, and
Mm-hmm.
they've figured out how to do it. And then the final example is Woowa Brothers, which is in South Korea. And they are an e-commerce company, sort of like DoorDash or Deliveroo, but they've done other stuff at the intersection of kind of digital and physical services. And they were the first ones to begin, one of the first in Korea, to shorten working hours back in 2015. They were at the time a relatively small company. They were, competing against Samsung and LG for really good talent. And so they saw shortening the work week partly as a way of sort of attracting people who might not otherwise think about going to work
Mm-hmm.
for an upstart company, but also as a way of sort of improving company culture. The founder was a guy who actually didn't have a background in software, but in design and sort of typeface stuff. And, for him, a lot of the way that the software and the tech industry in Korea worked was just, he was in a position where he could say, maybe this stuff is kind of stupid, right? Maybe long hours are counterproductive, which in fact
Mm-hmm.
they are. There's a lot of research that tells us this. And that maybe by sort of doing things differently, I can build a better company and sort of attract, more interesting people.
And now some might say, okay, like for tech companies that have sort of like global distributed workforces might even be an easier thing to do. There is sort of essential workers who will never be able to do that. But you even found examples for that. I think there's one in a nursing home, I think in Virginia, that you talk about that has also found a way for people to work less. Is that correct?
Right. So there are nursing homes that have adopted what they call the sort of 30-40 model, where nurses assistants, the people who are like the frontline workers, right, who help residents get dressed and fed and so forth, work 6-hour shifts. So they're on 30 hours a week, but they're paid for 40. And, you would think that this might not work financially because you always need these people. So you've just got to spend more money on salaries. But nursing homes and the nursing professional generally has a real problem with overwork and burnout, right? Keeping good people is really hard, even at top hospitals. And so what the nursing homes have found is that they were spending so much on temp agency workers who, you'd have to bring in at the last minute because someone didn't show up for their shift.
Mm-hmm.
Save so much money on that it actually pays for hiring, for
Wow.
having a bigger staff, and patient outcomes are better. You get fewer slips and falls. You have lower administration of psychotropic drugs, which tells you that, particularly for people with dementia, having familiar faces, having nursing staff who they can get to know and who can get to know them means that they have a better quality of life and better health. But we're also seeing this in, sort of other kinds of nursing with nurse managers. There's a big hospital in Korea that's doing a 4-day week for its nursing staff. And
Mm-hmm.
we at 4-day week global are now working with law enforcement. So the city of Golden's police department has implemented a 4-day work week. They're about halfway through their trial. And, if you can find two professions, where burnout are bigger issues and where you really don't want overworked, tired, stressed people making life and death decisions, like nursing and police are probably 1 and 2 on your list. So it's really great to see this moving from like, what we think of as like creative industries or professional services to, sort of to these kinds of frontline workers who often like hold our hold our lives and our and sort of and our health in their hands at some of our most sort of vulnerable moments.
Fascinating. And there is the momentum is growing that you turned from a weak signal into your own organization. Also on a governmental level, we read that the United Arab Emirates recently shifted through to like an officially 4.5-day work week, which is also kind of cool. So, which means they used to have a Friday, Saturday weekend. Now they're people are allowed to shut off earlier in the week and sort of have the Friday afternoon off. And here in the U.S., I think this was earlier this year, Congress endorsed a 32-hour work week act, also kind of cool, which is, I think, to fitting to what you described. So you pay employees overtime after 32 hours on the job. So there is a lot of stuff happening. However, though, I wonder, and I think you brought this to us as a community question, how many of us who are participating right now, who are on the show, who are listening in, are actually into that? How much are you all working? We want to know. And I think, Alex, when we asked you, like, what should we ask the room? You said, this is an easy one. How many hours do you work per week? So what do you think stands out here in the responses? Because I think we are, when we take the numbers here, we are moving in definitely beyond a 4-day work week with our community.
Yeah, I mean it's not a surprise. I mean the sort of even before the pandemic, sort of we had been we had reversed a centuries-long trend of working hours going down. And from about the 70s or early 80s, it had been the case that that the absolute number of hours that people worked in the West had gone from sometimes 3,000 a year to sort of under two. That had started nudging back up, and with the pandemic, with commutes turning into moving from one end of your couch to the other, people spending more time on Zoom, the number of hours that we spend working has sort of gone up even more in the last couple of years. And I think it's illustrative of the way in which, there were all sorts of defaults in the way that we are taught to work, in the way we use our devices, that nudge us always towards doing more work rather than less, right? Even when we see these, even with devices that theoretically save us labor, make it easier to, to do particular tasks, the degree to which we are connected to our devices or to our clients means that we end up spending spending that surplus trying to do more work. And one of the things that these companies, the 4-day week companies, do is have to kind of consciously break that cycle to say, we can use these technologies in ways that help us create more time that we can then give back to ourselves. But you got to really be thoughtful about that and, recognize and exploit the opportunity.
And I think you're hitting on something that's really crucial. And John, who has a photographic memory and has amazing quotes that he always enriches Remote Daily with, already said, like, there's this quote, 90% of paid work is time wasting crap. So there is a lot of official work hours that are non-productive. And since so many people were forced sort of into a different work environment during the pandemic, working hours went up, productivity sometimes went up. You mentioned this, and we are in some ways far away from many people from that 4-day work week. So I want to start now. We now know why you do this. We know who does it, and from some of them we know what they actually do. But I would like to get into the how and into the how to get started with you, Alex. And maybe let's start with you yourself. Like, how do you make sure that you don't overwork? How do you make sure that you work less and rest more in your day-to-day life?
Mm-hmm. you know, well, first off, I do sort of everything I talk about in my book, Rest, right? Sort of, I'm a big fan of naps. I tend to sort of get a start to the day pretty early, partly because I've got, 4-day week global has lots of sort of partners in Europe. So,
Pretty
Zoom
early,
calls
like
at 6
what?
a.m.,
California
like
time is
six,
at
like
5 a.m.
6,
6. Okay.
6, generally 6 a.m. California time. But you do this for about sort of 4 to 5 sort of really solid hours. And generally you can get, I find if I'm really sort of focused and heads down, I can get through just about everything I need to do sort of that day by, sort of within about 5 hours, maybe six. So sort of that's, but, making those, so the key for me is not trying to extend the day and make it, sort of work sort of more hours, but rather to make those peaks higher, right? To be able to, to find ways or tools or practices that allow me sort of to spend more of that time in flow, in deep work. And
Okay.
then the other,
So just to
so that's
stop here,
thing
because
number,
that
yeah.
requires a lot of work that you haven't talked about, which is it requires you to not set too many tasks,
Mm-hmm.
and it requires you to basically block your calendar certain
Right.
times of the day, and it requires you to during that time that you just described, let's say 6 a.m. to 11 a.m., to have notifications shut off, to maybe look into emails only for a certain amount of time, because you already like that's a very advanced level already that you start your day with. So there's a lot of
Uh-huh.
prep work that goes into it.
Yes. With the sort of the early mornings, actually start the night before. You set up as much as you possibly can, partly because I actually don't really like getting started at 6 in the morning or earlier. And so this is a sort of, it's a way of setting my future self up so that at 5:30, I don't have to make any real decisions, right? I know what clothes I'm going to wear. The coffee's set up. I can just be on sort of zombie mode until sort of I flip up the, sort of until I actually start work. But, I think that all the things that you describe, having to be more thoughtful about what particular tasks you do, doing this time blocking, sort of thinking about how to sort of organize the work better. These are things that, are great great when we can do them as individuals, and they're incredibly powerful when we can do them collectively. And that's one of the great lessons that 4-day week companies or have had is that, they often will redesign their work days so that everybody has a couple hours of deep focus time every day. So it's sort of like, going to the library during finals, right? You're not necessarily studying with other people, but just being in the presence of others who are really focused helps you concentrate. It also means, people have fewer distractions. There's less sort of interference or friction. You consciously don't schedule meetings in those periods.
Mhm.
But and that, the big lesson here is that we all have these challenges with figuring out how to sort of work better, how to do work that puts us into sort of flow. And that the way to solve, and that a really powerful way to solve this is to solve it together, right? To have sort of to change the structure of work that supports us rather than having to fight against it in order to get our work done, despite the, sort of the being in offices or workplaces that are constantly sort of pulling for our time and attention.
And then at 11 a.m., you actually take a nap?
I don't take a nap at 11, but it's a little later. In the afternoon, I will. I try to exercise before then, and then come back from the gym, and then it's a nap, and then sort of, and then it's basically time
Wow.
to take the dog out for another walk and make dinner.
Wait, you
So
exercise and nap every day in your workday?
yeah, I try. I don't always succeed, but that's the ideal. And the exercise for me is at this stage, like some days I go to the gym, some days I do yoga. I'm terrible at yoga, but it's one of these things that's actually really, like objectively, I'm not great at it, but I still get a lot out of it and a certain degree of like awareness of where my body is in space and
Mhm.
stuff. So even though my poses are lousy, it's like really
You're doing
valuable.
it.
That's actually,
Yeah.
that's actually a good lesson.
In
But
life. But now we have talked
exactly.
about your life, of course, and your life is the life, similar to some people here in the room who are bosses of their own time, and in at least some way, shape, or form, they can block their calendar off. When you come into an organization, let's
Mhm.
say, maybe what's the worst organization you could land yourself in? Maybe a hospital, or maybe a large insurance company that has for 100 years relied on military-like hierarchical structures. Every day is blocked from bottom to top. What do you do when you come in? Because you can't tell people to go into a flow, and take a nap, and go exercise. Like that, you have to start elsewhere. So when you come into an organization and they are interested in that, because they maybe have a forward thinking leader, like some of the ones who are in the room right now, who wants
So
to change things, what do you do? Like, where do you even begin?
where do we start? So studies tell us that we lose something like 2 to 3 hours of productive time every day to overly long meetings, to technology distractions, and to interruptions. And so, if you can get a handle just on those three things, you can go a long way to making it possible to do in 4 days what it's currently taking 5 or more. So that's where we start, right? You start with, yeah, meetings are great because we all know how to fix them. We all know that there are too many of them and they're a waste of time, and that by and that there's something that that you can only fix if you work together, right? It's mainly about changing the way that people think about time, or of being a little more disciplined, but everybody's got to do it. And so it's a great model for what you have to do in order to make the 4 day work sort of across your organization. And if you can solve that thing that everybody's complained about for a long time, that opens the question, what else around here can we fix? And then we often look at doing kind of two big things with technology. One is figuring out how to reduce distractions, and then the other is how you can use your devices or infrastructure to augment your ability to do your most important work. And then the other big thing we often do is redesign the workday itself, right? Setting aside either particular times of the day or the week for deep work that's separate from
Mm-hmm.
time with
Okay.
clients or meetings, which is also separate from social time, which you want to program in because you don't want the office to just turn into like a Dickensian workhouse, right?
Right.
Those social bonds are really important to maintain. And by implementing things like group lunches, you can go a long way to making sure that the culture is enhanced rather than eroded by the shift to a 4 day week. The final thing that everybody's got to learn is that this is very much a collective enterprise, right? It's not a structural one. It's not about each person individually improving their own efficiency by 20%. It's about redesigning systems. It's about changing company culture so that it becomes possible for everybody to be part of this and to enjoy the benefits.
Wow. So I'm trying to recap this. When you come into an organization, you question all their meetings. We had a guest actually on the show that said, when I took over CEO, I canceled every meeting that was on the schedule for my predecessor. People are furious, but I then started questioning everything, and it turns out 30 or 40% of the meetings actually could happen either without me or could be thrown out the window. And then you're saying it's very important to look at the entire week together and set aside undisrupted work that can turn into something you call flow, where people really have the feeling of nobody's bothering me right now. I can just focus on something. I don't have to be in something right now. I have one more thing that I found really fascinating, Alex, that while people are asking questions here, I want to get to, which is also about time, and it's the so-called 10,000-hour rule. There is a
Hey,
lot of people, when you scroll your Instagram or you scroll your LinkedIn these days, who are in the sort of self-help space, and they tell you, oh yeah, it's so easy, just take a master class with me, or just hop on this strict regime of working out with me, or just hone the skill on my YouTube channel, and in 100, 1,000, or in 10,000 hours, you will be there. You will be skillful. You will be in better than 99% of any other human on the planet who is trying to achieve the same thing. So you're out there saying, sorry guys, 10,000 hour rule, bogus. Why is that in your opinion?
Well, I would say that we misinterpret the 10,000 hours rule. If you go back in two ways. Number one, this is, one of the things that I argue in Rest is that incredibly high achievers tended to work about 4 or 5 hours a day, right? Sort of really deep work, highly focused, and that was as much time as you needed to write The Origin of Species or the Fifth Symphony. Why the 4 or 5 hours? Well, the 10,000 hours rule is 10,000 hours across about a decade. So that works out to 1,000 hours sort of a year, assuming you take weekends off and the occasional vacation. Let's say that's 250 days. That works out to 4 hours a day. Now, there are particular things in deliberate practice that sort of the original article talks about, but sort of leaving those aside, the other really interesting thing from that study was that not only do the high performers in that study sort of practice about 4 hours a day, which seems to be about as much as you can be like really heads down and concentrated on something before your mind really starts to give out. But those people also slept more than the average student, in part because they took naps in the afternoon. And they spent less time in leisure activities, but they were more thoughtful about how they spent their leisure time. And so it's not just the 10,000 hours, but it's also 12,500 hours of leisure and about 30,000 hours of sleep. But that's over the course of a decade. And so that's what, and so it's not 10,000 hours of like 12-hour days, but rather of something that is much more manageable and sustainable.
I see. So it's about breaking down the hours and being realistic around this,
yes,
instead of just always claiming, that the 10,000 rule will bring me anywhere.
Right.
Great. Yeah. It's great to know about this, and it's good to hear about that, because it sounds so easy and it's not at all. And I want to now dive into questions from our community. We already had a few on Menti, of course, and we will get to those in a minute. Please click the chat link that was just shared by Aveli, our head of community here at Remote Daily, in the Zoom chat, or follow the Menti code 65412079 to ask us questions. And I want to come to Paul's question because he was first here, who is, of course, a remote employer, and says that theoretically we can tap into a global talent pool as a 4-day week remote company. But what is actually the best way to do this, Alex? That is what Paul is interested in. How do I reach the elite talent pool willing to work in our business that has a 32-hour week instead of a 40-hour work week? Like, how do I actually find these people? How can I attract them? What is advice that you would have, Alex, for Paul's hiring spree?
First off, there are a couple sort of places that specifically sort of our job markets focused on sort of 4-day week. That's that sort of mechanical possibility. The other thing, though, I would say is that if you are public about moving to a 4-day week, you talk about it, really good people find you. And, I hear time and again, right, stories of getting a 5x or 10x increase in the number of applications for sort of open positions when companies move to 4-day weeks. But importantly also, it's something that tends to attract sort of more senior, more experienced people, right? Basically, the folks who have been working as developers or engineers for 10 or 15 years, maybe they've got a family now. They recognize sort of, I don't want to sleep under my desk. And that's a stupid way to try to solve problems anyway. And a 4-day week offers a kind of set of challenges about how to optimize your day, to optimize your work, that is really appealing to a certain class of, of worker across all kinds of industries. Now, it may not be that, that this attracts the, 10x, the self-declared 10x or 100x engineer, but it will mean that you can build far better teams, which, there's a whole thing which arguably, can outperform those couple sort of, spectacular individuals.
Interesting. And I feel like there's also a growing movement of platforms out there. One was just shared by Anne here in the chat to the more technical aspect, Alex, that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul could go to 4dayweek.io, 4 as in the number 4, dayweek.io, post the job there. This is also part of the movement that you're spearheading. People who are collecting these jobs, searching the web, putting them on a platform together so that everybody who wants to change the way they work can look on this platform and feel part of something much bigger, feel part of the movement. Great advice from so many angles here, Alex. And I want to switch to Menti, and I love this question. It was voted up because, of course, people are always, when somebody like you comes in and says, guys, it's possible to change, it's possible to work less, they always want to know, how did you do it? So the question here is, what was the hardest interpersonal challenge that you actually had to overcome when you shifted your own schedule? We haven't talked about this. There was also another question here on Menti that says, how many hours do you actually work a week, Alex? So maybe you can answer these both at the same time.
Yeah, I'm probably at the sort of 30 hours a week level or so, and have, and for me, like I said, it's about making the peaks higher rather than sort of trying to sort of stretch out the day. In terms of interpersonal challenges, writing books and doing a lot of the kind of work that I do is a pretty individual exercise. So I didn't have to do a lot of negotiation with sort of bosses or colleagues in order to make this viable. But, one of the really important things with, about the 4-day week movement is that it solves the problem that this question identifies, namely that designing your own schedule often puts you in conflict with your colleagues by giving the 4-day week to everybody, right? Turning it from a kind of zero-sum game where you have to figure out how to make this work for you, and maybe raising questions about sort of your sort of professionalism or really how much work you're doing. And this is the case even in well-meaning companies that have pretty progressive policies, to a win-win in which everybody has to work together in order to make it possible for everybody at the end of the day, Thursday, to start their weekend.
So you evaded the question a little bit, but what I hear through is that you had to learn how to collaborate on your schedule more. Do I understand that correctly?
I did that because when I started doing this, I was sort of, I was really just a company of one.
Right.
There wasn't a lot of there wasn't a lot of stuff that I had to do with colleagues. So, but I recognize that it is an issue that a lot of people have, and the way to solve it is for everybody to solve it together.
Yeah, this is something really important for me to learn also, coming out of this conversation with you, that it's always put upon us, like so many of these suggestions for deep flow work, or get better at remote leadership, or get better at organizing your day, structure it differently for your own mental health. Yeah, it's always put upon us as individuals, but it's unsolvable for us alone. We have to deal with the people around us, or with, in your case, also Ariel. You have to build her into your workday and make sure that she helps you to rest and you help her to, get out there and snap some fresh air. So I think the collaboration piece, I think, is absolutely crucial. And maybe we can get one more question in before the closing. What do you think about non-office industries.
Mhm.
How is the movement going there? How can they latch on to the 4-day work week, in your opinion, or are already latching onto it?
Yeah. First off, definitely already latching onto it. Think of nurses or of police. There are restaurants that have moved either to 4-day work weeks or moved staff to 4-day work weeks. Mainly, that's about a recruitment and retention thing, especially retention. The freelancers in the gig economy. This is a tougher nut because this is a these are labor markets that are very much built around treating workers as atomized individuals who are incapable of collective action. But I think that so I think that ultimately, if we are able to to have legislation that shortens working hours, then we'll see benefits for freelancers. But until then, it's difficult. It illustrates the difficulties of freelancers engaging in in collective action, and that's a real shame because in a sense, everything that we've been saying about working together to shorten working hours, to come up with common schedules, to solve problems in work-life balance, all of this tells us that in a sense, we think of all these kinds of challenges mainly as individual ones,
Mm-hmm.
but solving them together is really powerful. And in a sense, collective action turns out to be the most potent form of self-care. And, if you can harness that, then you can do great things for yourself and for your colleagues and for everybody.
I feel like this conversation is going so much deeper than just working less and resting more, because it really asks for us to think about the structure of how companies and even our own lives as self-employed people are organized. And Liz just mentioned in the chat, it's all about also about unionizing and having a voice together. But I'm so glad, Alex, that we at least could start the conversation with you here today. And last question, before we part ways today, how can we support you? How can we help you grow the movement? What is the final message that you want to share with us?
I think the final message is to come back to the idea that the 4-day week is already here, and it is more accessible and closer to your workplace than than you might imagine, and that this is not while ultimately it is about rethinking the place of work in our lives and and answering some big questions. You really can get started with very practical things, right? Doing stuff like shortening meetings, blocking, the time blocking. These are very practical things you can do to solve very practical problems that then give you more time, that give time back. So I think treat it as a solution to to enduring problems you've had, and enjoy the benefits.
Alex, thank you for reminding us how to live healthier and how to enjoy work more by doing less. I think you gave some very, very good advice today. You are